Good morning, or well, good afternoon, Focus families. Thank you so much for joining us today. Without further wait, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce Alexa Kelly to you. Alexa, take it away.
All right. Hi, guys. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a wonderful afternoon so far. My name is Alexa Kelly, and I'm a local speech language pathologist in the Metro Atlanta area. And today I'll be presenting on functional communication activities on a budget. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. All right. So we will go ahead and get going here. So the first slide, it says speech on a budget, functional and affordable activities to target communication skills. And again, my name is Alexa. All right. So this is going to be our general agenda for today. So we'll be discussing different home activity types and the benefits of the different home activities. We'll also talk about low cost options. So if you are interested in investing in some new toys or activities, I can give you some examples of those. I'll also, of course, be talking about no cost options. So if you don't have a budget for buying new toys or investing in, new apps or activities or whatever, I'll go over some kind of like functional, no cost around the house sort of activities. Um, I'll also go over accommodations or modifications to these home activities. As I'm sure you guys know, every kid is going to be different. So they may respond to certain activities differently. So we'll talk about how to accommodate those to meet the special interests of your child. Then after that, we'll go over some closing remarks and then a Q&A if anyone's interested in asking some questions. All right. So the list of activities I have here are kind of just based on modality. So, what you're using to engage with your child in play. So I have, of course, toys like physical manipulatives. I've got websites on here for older kids. Books are great for all ages. There's also the option of board games, like non-digital games as well. And then we'll also talk a little bit about sensory play and how that can benefit your child as well. So it'll kind of go in that order, I believe. We might bounce around a little bit, but those are the general activities that we'll be covering today. All right. So the first thing I wanted to cover in this presentation was the use of toys. So of course, any child that is, growing and developing in the early stages, even some kids I've worked with that are, a little bit on the older side, like 10 years old, love playing with toys. Everyone loves toys. I find that the best toys for reinforcing communication skills are those that foster open-ended play. So, what is open-ended play? Open-ended play is essentially the use of games or activities that don't have a rigid or restricted response or, kind of having a rigid step-by-step kind of routine. Not giving any close-ended questions, like, simple yes or no questions during the activity. It's just something that's open-ended where there's no rules really, and you can kind of just explore with the toy in any way that's possible. So I've listed some do's and don'ts for how to play with toys to elicit language, because as I'm sure you know, if you're a parent, there's all kinds of toys out there, and some might be, a benefit to eliciting communication, and there's some that kind of can hinder that or inhibit that. So some of the do's and don'ts that I find with toys is you do want to find toys that involve reciprocal play. So sometimes there's toys that are kind of automated that are meant to perform. So like kind of character toys, I like to call them. So it's like maybe, an Elmo or some other character that's kind of like talking at your child. Those tend to be, again, more based on performance aspect. So it kind of encourages your kid to listen, stop and listen, and get maybe fixated on the lights and sounds that are coming out of the toy. rather than actually engaging in something that can elicit a back and forth. So any kind of reciprocal play, no matter how, advanced the toy is or simple, is going to be the most beneficial to elicit that communication, because it's going to allow you to practice turn taking with your child and engaging in activities that involve like a back and forth, as it mirrors conversation. So if you have a really young child, like 2 or 3, and you're rolling a ball back and forth, even though they may not be engaging in full blown conversation yet, it's teaching them that idea that they can go back and forth with somebody during a turn taking task, which can kind of mirror conversation later on down the road. Something I also recommend is do incorporate toys that replicate activities of daily living, or ADLs. So I love toys that foster this kind of ability to explore within the realm of like everyday simple routines, because that's going to be the most functional for kids, right? So um, little kitchen play sets are awesome. I've seen lots of my kids use like the little ice cream maker sort of sets. I've seen all kinds of things, little toys that are like um, a vacuum cleaner, all kinds of things. Um, I've seen some that are like, a construction worker pretending to be a construction worker. All of those are great because they're open-ended and they foster imagination. So it can be really, really good, really applicable. Speaking of imagination, do you use toys that foster imagination? And this is kind of going into that open-ended play aspect of things. When activities are close-ended and they don't give opportunity for lots of responses, or ways to kind of move through the interaction, it can be a bit limiting. So if again, it's just kind of a toy that's making noise and talking at your kid rather than, engaging in an activity that has a back and forth with a real person, it's kind of close-ended. The interaction stops there. So any toys or any activities in general that foster imagination and being able to kind of interact with things, whether it be conventional or unconventional, just getting to explore. Exploration is one of the best tools, I would say, to elicit communication. As far as the don'ts go, so I would say, as you've probably heard me mention, kind of like character toys. So you'll see a lot of overlap with that in these don'ts. So don'ts, don't find toys that use lots of sounds. Sometimes these performative toys can be a bit of a distraction for kids. And let's say you're trying to, ask them about like what color the toy is. They might be so fixated on the sounds, that they may have a hard time processing what you're saying alongside what the toy is doing. So it can be hard for kids to kind of, process that auditory information, kind of switching from you and the toy. And they're going to inevitably get kind of fixated on the toy that's making lots of fun and interesting sounds. So I would say that would be a hard pass for me in terms of, eliciting communication. Another thing I would say to not do is don't use toys that talk at your child. Again, this is kind of, when we think about, watching TV or going on YouTube and being on an iPad, all of those kind of activities are more to perform for your child. They're more to talk at them rather than talking with them. Anything that's kind of one-sided like that is really just going to be focusing more on them, getting overstimulated by the lights and sounds and, the different performative aspects of the toy. Now, if you have a child with really good joint attention skills, so being able to kind of look between you and the toy, then sometimes it can be fun to use those toys. But I find most of the time, kids, especially kids that are maybe more sensory seeking, will get more fixated on what the toy is doing rather than actually engaging in conversation with you about it. The last don't is don't use toys that take away from person-to-person interactions. So again, kind of thinking about those performative toys, they're going to get fixated more on the object rather than you as the parent or caregiver. So focus on interactions, toys, no matter how simple they are, even if it's just rolling a ball back and forth, that's person-to-person interaction. It's giving them practice being able to, you know, look at you and watch your body language and practicing various pragmatic or like social communication skills, being able to request for a turn in a game, being able to, describe what they want to do with the toy. There's so much you can do with a person-to-person interaction that a sort of kind of high-tech performative toy can't really foster. So I have on this next slide some examples of different speech and language targets for open-ended toys. So, let's keep going with the example of like a ball, rolling a ball back and forth. So there's so much vocabulary that you can use there. So labeling what you're doing with the ball, roll, bounce, kick, pass, all of these action words, identifying. Maybe you have, more than one ball that's in different colors. You can practice following directions. Oh, can you bring me the ball that's blue? Something like that. Practicing imitation. A lot of times I'll do like a ready, set, go sort of thing for kids that are practicing those early language skills. Ready, set, go. And so they're learning go, they're learning how to kind of use that early stage of inflection, they're learning imitation. From an articulation standpoint, they can also learn different speech sounds with an activity like that. No matter how early those sounds are or how complex those sounds are. So some early developing sounds, of course, would be like the oh, you want the ball, or oh, you want to pass the ball. Being able to, again, when you're in that reciprocal interaction, they'll be able to see your face, so you can give a lot of visual models and cues for different sounds, whichever ones they're targeting. And again, even like for older kids where they might be not so much at like a floor level where they're rolling a ball back and forth, but maybe they're playing basketball outside, being able to pass and, focusing on those S sounds that come later on, being able to, say like, oh, round one, here's round one of our activity with the ball, all kinds of things like that. Fluency. So if you have a child that has some stuttering challenges, being able to engage in open-ended play is the best practice for that, because it's giving them a low pressure situation to be able to practice using longer utterances to use their technique. So if they're practicing their easy speech, they can, describe what they're doing with the toy and practice kind of slowing down and sounding out those words nice and clear. Social skills, of course, any kind of play is going to be that early stage social communication activity. So taking turns, joint attention, requesting. There's really so much that, you can do with these kind of toys. And to be honest, these are my favorite toys when I'm working with kids, because there's so much you can do with them and there's no limitations on what you can do with them. So it can be really great for fostering communication. So here are some examples of open-ended toys. So these are ones that you might see in a speech clinic, for example. So, of course, different kinds of balls, basketballs, or even just like basic bouncy balls, beach balls, kids love because they're really lightweight and they can kind of, bounce really easily in the air. Doll houses, love doll houses because you can work on all kinds of things. Oh, can you put the dolly in the bed, on the second floor, working on different prepositions or position words. Those are really crucial for following directions. Asking WH questions, ooh, who is sleeping? Who is eating? Even practicing the use of pronouns, ooh, she is eating. Ooh, whose cake is it? It's her cake at the table. Practicing all these kinds of things can be a natural way to elicit these targets, but in a way that's fun and engaging as well. A little like doctor kit is really fun. Again, kind of like channeling those activities of daily living and imaginative play within the confines of, an occupation can be really fun. So, a lot of kids want to be a veterinarian when they grow up. So, practicing, having little plushies around the house and talking about, oh, like, what's wrong with the kitty, and being able to kind of talk through, oh, what's the first thing we should do first, then last, again, can you put the stethoscope on the kitty's chest, that sort of thing. So it can be really good for that. And again, just kind of fostering imagination. Animal toys, figurines are always great. Kids love farm animals. I love a good farm animal barn set is great. And of course, blocks. Lots of kids, like their first toy that they engage with outside of, maybe a barn set is blocks. So again, talking about action words, being able to stack or put on those position words again, giving simple directions, building up those early language scripts. Ooh, are you going to knock down the tower? Ready, set, go. And then you push down the tower. There's so much you can do with toys like this. And really, at the end of the day, it's about making language fun and exciting for kids. So this is the perfect way to go about that. Here's just like a quick example of how I would use open play to target like different things with bubbles. So speech targets, you might be able to target lip rounding. So their ability to kind of make that roundness. If you have a kiddo that's having a hard time with breath control, being able to practice that level of breath support to make a bubble come out, that's a great thing for that. Language targets, bubble, blow, pop, my turn, more please, up, down, oops, gone. There's so many different things you can say there. Of course, practicing requesting is really important. So, oh, do you want more bubbles? If you've got a kid that's working on sign language, more bubbles, more bubbles, or, just being able to engage in verbal play with them, like, ooh, pop, 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 getting them to really attend to the mouth. It's a great toy for that. Everyone loves bubbles. Speech therapists love bubbles too. So that's kind of an example of how I would, engage in open-ended play to target language with a specific toy like this. All right, so I wanted to give some examples of like character toys or music toys to avoid. So this is kind of an example of what I would call like a character toy. So any kind of toy that's meant to kind of just perform at your child and kind of, just do different things. It's essentially doing the same thing that like a television would do for your child. So just kind of doing things at them. Now, again, if you have a kid that has really good joint attention skills, like they're able to kind of look back and forth between you and the toy and they don't kind of lose that acknowledgement that you're there, then this can be nice. But sometimes it can be a little bit too much, a little too overwhelming for kids. All right, so I have a list of different Amazon low-cost toy options here. I'm not going to click on this list to go straight to it, but maybe what we can do is we can send that link, at the end of the presentation or something like that, and then you can take a look at these toys. These are toys that I curated in a list that I think would be really good for fostering language and communication in early language learners. So there's that. All right, so now we're getting into no cost options. So maybe you don't want to go on Amazon and find, various toys. Maybe you have lots of toys, or maybe you don't have a budget to buy any more toys. And you're just looking for like, how do I target language skills, without the use of new stuff? So here's some different examples. So if, again, we have an early language learner, someone who's kind of slowly picking up on language word by word, then you can play, just again, reciprocal play through something like peekaboo, targeting different sounds. You've got the P's and the B's, using those mouth models, pointing. You can work on sign language, like, ooh, I open, close, ooh, you want more peekaboo, all kinds of things like that. Action words, oh, look at me, hide. What am I doing? I'm hiding. Where did I go? Teaching question words, teaching again, like my turn, your turn. So whose turn is it? My turn. Whose turn is it? Your turn. Action words like here I go. Let's do peekaboo. Here I go. And then, of course, simple pronouns like, I'm going to play peekaboo. You're doing peekaboo now. Your turn. Um, and then you also have the option of doing pretend play with various household items. So one of my, criteria for good open-ended play, toys, was kind of mirroring day-to-day ADLs, right? So what better way to target ADL centric language than using household items that you would, want these language skills to generalize to anyway? Like use the household manipulatives that you have. The toys don't have to be toys to be able to be played with. It's all kind of about exploration and, kind of just exploring things and learning different ways to engage with something. So for example, if you wanted to do like pretend play in a kitchen, so, just grabbing different like, plastic Tupperware, maybe some food items, pretend like, they're cooking something up for you, if they're eating a snack of some berries or whatever, putting the berries on the plate, like, ooh, I'm a customer. Can I have a strawberry, please? And then they put the strawberry on your plate. Those kind of things can be really fun and it's still play. It's just not necessarily with toys, right? Um, you can also DIY puppets with old socks, of course. You can kind of engage in like a back and forth play, like, hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you? Just kind of going back and forth there can be really fun. Also, the process of DIYing the toy itself can be good for language. So if you got a kiddo that's ready to follow directions to create something, then you can ask them questions like, ooh, like what color eyes should we put on your puppet? What color hair should we put on your puppet? All kinds of things like that can be really fun. Even just that process of curating the toy can be fulfilling from a language standpoint. You can do like a pretend storefront, again, like kind of replicating these occupations, community helpers. So maybe you are cleaning out your closet, you've got to donate some stuff to Goodwill. Use it as an opportunity to kind of do some pretend play with some toys, or with some clothes and pretend, So it's like, oh, I need to buy one shirt, please. And targeting things, language like shirt, pants, shoes, buy, give, lots of those action words are in there too. It can be a great opportunity to, again, just kind of foster imagination. Imagination is really the biggest thing in terms of eliciting language. And then, of course, exploring in nature. So the outside world is a perfect place to just kind of talk about what you see, right? Fostering imagination. You can kind of do what you would do as a kid, grab a stick from outside, pretend you're a wizard or something, walk around and explore the trees and talk about the birds. It's really all about how you ask the questions. So, you know, what, what are we going to do in the forest today? Ooh, what is that in the tree? Asking WH questions can be really helpful for creating an open-ended activity. So any of those WH, who, what, when, where, why, that's going to automatically make anything you do around the house an open-ended play activity. So always remember to use those open-ended WH questions. All right, so now we're going to get into books. So books are obviously a helpful way to target speech and language skills, and they can be used for different purposes. So targeting speech sounds, of course, if there's a book that's, has a regularly occurring sound, like llama, llama, red pajama, working on those L's. Identifying pictures, so being able to open a picture book and be able to point to representation, symbolic representations of different animals or different people and what they're doing. Being able to label, so pointing to and saying the name of something that they see in a book, it's really good for that. Answering WH questions again. So WH questions are always going to come back as a tool for eliciting like open-ended play or open-ended engagement. So, who is on the swing in the picture? Who is, going to the beach in the story, something like that. For older kids that might be working on more complex language skills, working on the main idea and detail, so summarizing things that they've heard in the story. So, oh, what was the main idea of this story? Like, what was your main takeaway? Are there any details that you remember from the story? Being able to answer comprehension questions based on the material. Sequencing. So, working on first, then last, being able to kind of verbally sequence and narrate the events of the story from start to finish can be a really great opportunity to practice some of those, higher order language skills. Um, as well as some social communication, there's aspects of that too. So being able to describe feelings of characters, the appearance of items in a book, ooh, like that's messy, that's clean, that's long, that's short, being able to talk about all of those descriptors. So there's so much we can do with books, of course. So it's a great tool for that. Here's another do's and don'ts list that I have for books. So, even though books are pretty self-explanatory with what you would do with a book, when I think about how to elicit communication from a book, there's some do's and don'ts. Like if I was to use a book in a session, there are some things that I would make sure to do with a book, and then there's some things I would make sure to not do with a book if I'm wanting to kind of increase that language output. So things I would do is describe the pictures and ask questions. Even if you're not reading the story word for word, just talking about what you see in the picture and kind of presenting things in a low to no expectation sort of situation, almost like you're a child yourself, being able to comment on what you see. Ooh, I see a bird. Ooh, look at that plane. That's cool. Just being able to describe and comment on what you see in the pictures. It's really good. And then another do is I would try to promote critical thinking skills in the book. So kind of again, the inferencing maybe. So like, what do you think will happen next? Allowing yourself to kind of stop and pause at a certain point of the story and ask these sort of critical thinking questions. How do you think the character feels? What do you think they're going to do next? How do you think the story is going to end? That's great for older kids, of course. Something else I would do is using lots of vocal changes in tone and pitch while reading. So I would go through and I'd be able to say like, ooh, there once was a boy who lived on the hill. Using these kind of up and downs is it's actually called parentese, like being able to use upward and downward inflection is really valuable in terms of just kind of highlighting different semantics, different concepts, if you will. So I never read something monotone or like quickly. So you'll actually see it's kind of segueing into the don'ts. So I don't only focus on the words in the story. So a lot of times I'll see, parents, when we start introducing the idea of using a book, they'll do what we would traditionally expect with a book, of course, and read it, and it's good to kind of practice understanding that, okay, this is what we do with the book and kind of setting that expectation. But there's also so much you can do, to kind of bring this to your child's level. So maybe they like looking at this book, but they can't read yet, beyond their level of comprehension. Well, you can bring it down to their level by just kind of talking about things that they see in the book, even if it's like a way, way out of their range reading level book. If there's pictures, and we can still talk about it. Reading with only one tone of voice. So again, it's kind of negating that parent ease if you go kind of monotone. And, from an auditory discrimination standpoint, it's kind of hard for kids to kind of single out words if everything kind of sounds like one run-on word, so to speak. So using that upward and downward inflection is really good for highlighting various semantic concepts that you're trying to teach. Last don't is don't read quickly. So, make sure that if you are going to read word for word from the book, again, use the up and down, but also pace yourself. So it's giving your child time to process the information. A lot of times I find if you go too fast, then the kids might still be kind of stuck on what was said on the previous page or something like that. So just make sure that you take things slow and you give your kid time to process what you're talking about. All right. So here are some recommended books. These are books that I love to use in my sessions. So with younger kids, I might use like The Very Hungry Caterpillar. It's great for teaching, um, the life cycle of animals, different things like caterpillars and butterflies, food items, of course. So if you're working on, being able to identify or label food items, it's a great story for that. Being able to count, working on those counting words, I have 2 oranges, 5 plums, that sort of thing. Plurals. So even when we're talking about plural forms of nouns in the story, he ate 2 oranges, and being able to practice that S word ending is really good for that story. Pete the Cat is great. Um, it has kind of a song melody to it also. So it's great for using that upward and downward inflection. It's kind of embedded into the story. Talks about colors, Pete the Cat. I love my white shoes. That's really the story specifically that I think of when I think of Pete the Cat is I love my white shoes. That's a really good one. And it's got kind of fun little commentary throughout. So if you're trying to teach your child how to kind of just use fun exclamatory sort of statements, being able to say, oh no, being able to imitate things like that because he steps in the mud and, it can be fun. And then, of course, there's a million iterations of There Once Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a. These books are really great for seasonal vocabulary. There's always one for like St. Patrick's Day, Valentine's, Easter, Christmas. So I guarantee you, if you search There Once Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a, and then you type in something related to seasonal vocab, you would be able to find a version of the story. And it's great as well for just identifying, labeling, and answering questions about what she swallowed. If you give a mouse a cookie is great. If you think about the title of the book, if kind of inferential, it's like, if you give a mouse a cookie, what is he going to do? Kind of open-ended there. Go Dog Go is great. It covers so many concepts, various vocabulary words. Again, great for early language learners. Polar bear, what do you hear? Again, targeting WH questions, being able to describe what they hear and being able to understand the action of what hear even means. There's so much you can pull apart from a story like that. Llama Llama Red Pajama, again, for speech sounds is really good for those L's. If you have a kid that's kind of learning rhyming and understanding how rhymes work, this is a great book for that as well. Really at the end of the day, explore your child's special interest and see what kind of books they gravitate towards. You can, of course, pick out any one of these books for them to get interested in. But if you take them to a library and you kind of just see what they like, then you can really incorporate language into any of those things. So what you'll see here is low or no cost options for books. So a lot of times, it's hard to make a trip to the public library or, being able to buy a physical book off Amazon. So what I always recommend is looking up these YouTube read alouds. So they'll always have like a little video that you can watch and then just kind of like going through, and it animates some of the story, and the images are usually like not overstimulating. So it's really good. And sometimes it can help maintain attention a little bit easier than a physical book can. So that's an option there. Let's see. All right. So kind of pivoting from books, we've got sensory play. So I'm sure that you have experience with a child, or this could be your child that's very sensory motivated. So they may not have a traditional way that they play with toys. They might be more sensory motivated. So sensory play is, rather than focusing on a specific toy, it involves the use of various household objects or items that cater to one's sensory preferences. So the goal of this activity, or the goal of this play style overall, is to engage the nervous system through sensory integration and self-regulation. So if you have a kid that, loves to move around the room and they like to rock back and forth, they love to feel certain things on their skin, then this would be a good play method for them to elicit language. So some examples of sensory play. So this is going to be a great DIY category because you can really do so much with sensory play just from a household object standpoint. They do have these out now, these little like sensory bin kits that you can find at Michael's. Those are really good and not too expensive. I think they're around like $10 or something like that. You can also DIY your own sensory bin kits. Like if you go to Dollar Tree, that's what I always ended up doing if I needed to make a sensory bin with specific things going on with a theme. Play-Doh, of course, can be kind of a sensory form of play, and it's very open-ended. It allows kids to kind of experiment with touch and textures. And, if you have little cookie cutouts, you can create shapes and, have them maybe label what they see based on that symbol that they've cut out of the Play-Doh. So like a star, a heart, that sort of thing. Bubble wrap is always fun. So, maybe if you're trying to get your child to learn how to like point or identify things, you'll see there's kind of like a picture of something underneath. And so you could maybe say like, ooh, like, can you touch the caterpillar? And there's a picture of a caterpillar and you have the bubble wrap over the top. It'll kind of give them that sensory input to kind of like push or want to practice that early skill of pointing to identify. I saw this one picture over here online I thought was really fun. So using things like water, some kids love to play in water, and that's like a big sensory motivator for them. So being able to do various activities like putting things in a little bath or a little tub of water. Looks like they have some ice in there or something. Really, really, really fun. And then we've got kind of like a sensory, like a visual sensory thing with this little kid. So being able to put like fun things inside of something, being able to shake it up and being able to talk about various things that they see in the jar. So, ooh, shake, shake, shake. Ooh, purple, purple. There's so much you can do with sensory play that can still engage language just as much as a traditional toy would. So sensory play, how do I DIY? So, it kind of depends on your child's sensory diet as well. So if you find that they have a very specific preference for things, not every single sensory play toy, if you just type in sensory play, is going to be, ideal for your child. You may have to kind of watch and see what they like to play with and then create a sensory activity that replicates that. Pinterest is a great tool for gathering ideas, looking at tutorials on YouTube for inspiration. Some common household items for sensory bins that I'll use are like dry rice, beans, water, ice. Again, kids love that sensory aspect of water. You can even incorporate temperature into it, so like making it really cold. Pom-poms are nice, they're fuzzy. Beads can be kind of smooth. Some kids like that smoothness. Um, for general sensory play, there's lots of things. So bubble wrap, again, you may have some kids that love to explore with certain textures like shaving cream, being able to like draw certain shapes in the the shaving cream, and being able to talk about things that they're doing, like, ooh, I'm drawing a heart, heart. Even talk about the actions that you're doing, drawing, squish or push or poke, all of those actions that you would do with something just to kind of engage in a sensory way. If you have kiddos that can tolerate certain like food textures, so like yogurt, oatmeal, that can be kind of fun too. Just having them during snack time, just kind of experiment with their food and play with their food and talk about, not just the object itself, ooh, this is oatmeal, but also being able to talk about the actions that you do with the food, being able to touch and move things around, being able to teach things like, oh, wow, those exclamatory words like, ooh, that's so much fun. Wow, I like this. Of course, requesting, commenting, all of those kinds of things. Um, you can even fill a jar with visually stimulating trinkets or toys. So kind of like that kid with the little sensory jar. So having tinsel or like fairy lights in there. Sometimes you can fill it with water and put oil in there with food coloring, and then you can have them shake it up and watch it. And there's so much opportunity in that just to practice describing, especially if it's really motivating for a child. DIY Play-Doh is also an option. So if you don't want to go out and buy Play-Doh, or maybe you have a kid that's really young and you don't want them to accidentally eat the Play-Doh or something, there's so many recipes out there for DIY edible Play-Doh. So it's safe for kids if they, ingest it. All right. So if I'm thinking about how to use sensory play to elicit speech and language, I might, practice describing or commenting on what they feel, see, smell, etc. So if I'm playing in a sensory bin filled with rice and maybe like there's little toys or trinkets buried inside, I might comment by saying, "Oh, you found they found a tiger buried in the sand, or rice, talking about how the rice feels on your fingers. Ooh, that feels good. If they like that sensation, talking about the actions they're doing to engage in the rice, like, ooh, like dig in the rice. What did you find? Ooh, let's scoop, kind of providing that language enrichment that way. Using simple emotion words to describe feelings. So again, practicing like the social communication aspect of commenting, like, so fun, I like this. Or even if they don't like it, sensory play can also be very motivating in the realm of self-advocacy. So being able to say like, ooh, I don't like this, no more of this. It's also a great opportunity for that as well. Um, let's see. All right, so we're kind of in the home stretch here. So websites and games. So this can be kind of tricky because again, you might have some kids that want to perseverate on things online, and that's totally normal. Websites are great for kids who are older. I would not recommend any like screen time for virtual games, or websites for the use of teaching for kids under 5. I think sometimes it can be a little bit too overstimulating for them. And again, we think about those performative toys that kind of perform at someone. Sometimes websites can have a similar effect and it can be a little overstimulating. So just being careful there. Some websites that I love to use, like for speech sessions, if I'm going virtual, are ABCY, boomlearning.com, pbskids.org is great. There's so much you can do with those virtual games, talking about different concepts and answering and asking questions and everything. Board games are also great for teaching language skills, like taking turns, following directions, just building a vocabulary, being able to describe, who's going first? I'm going first. So being able to understand like sequential terminology. It's also a great tool for teaching self-regulation, being able to kind of use language to describe their feelings if they're upset that they lost a game. It can be really valuable for older kids to practice some of that language learning as well. Let's see. So, kind of on the topic of older kids, you might have some older kids at home that have a special interest or a certain character that they like. So maybe like a video game character like Sonic the Hedgehog, they might be into trading cards, something like that. So with this population, I know it can be a bit challenging to try to get them to redirect from that special interest. But sometimes what you can do rather than trying to redirect the child away from their special interest activity is you can kind of use it to your advantage and, being able to incorporate communication goals or skills into the video game that they're playing. Maybe they are playing a game, that has very vivid visuals, being able to describe what they're doing in the game, give them directions to follow, kind of treat it like a virtual scavenger hunt. Like, ooh, can you find something red in that environment? Can you find something that would be wet or dry? Something like that. Asking them to describe to you all of the steps that they need to complete a mission or a quest. So if they're, working on a side quest in a game, being able to have them narrate to you all of the steps that it would take to complete that task. Um, and maybe even exploring how it could go right or go wrong, and answering why questions related to those things. Why would it go wrong if we did this? Simple problem solving skills can be targeted through things like video games or online special interests. So I'm giving a quick example here. I know the Minecraft movie came out recently, so you might have some kiddos who love Minecraft. Let's say you walk into your child's room and you see this visual on the screen. How would you make speech and language happen out of this? So there's lots you could do, even from a speech sound production standpoint, to language, to social skills, even grammar, right? So, maybe you have a kid that's working on the S sound. Ooh, there's a fence, there's a sunset, vines, trees, etc. So there's lots of S input there. Vocabulary. You can target lots of concepts like high and low, that tree's up high, we're down low. Dark and light, the sky's getting dark, it's getting darker outside, there's only a little bit of light left. Material description, so like something being made out of wood, or something like that. Games like Minecraft involve a lot of material, so being able to describe textures is really good from a language standpoint. Social communication, so being able to answer personal questions. What is your favorite part about the stage? Maybe just kind of engaging with your child in that social way and seeing if they can answer those simple questions. Even grammar and morphemes. So, being able to describe using ing word endings. The sun is setting. There's so much you can do even with just a simple screenshot. So that's how I would recommend engaging if there's a special interest in mind. Just a quick little disclaimer with screens and online content. Be aware of high stimulation content. This is a really good article that talks about the digital era. It's a brand new study, and how dopamine feedback loops are a huge component to why kids will get stuck on different games and things online. So, a dopamine driven feedback loop would be when you're encouraged to keep consuming pleasurable stimuli to prevent a dopamine deficit. So, dopamine's like that happy chemical in our brain. So, if you're kind of stuck on something that has this feedback loop where you never want to be out of dopamine, it can be really detrimental to communication because it creates this ease of perseveration. So, whenever you're reviewing online content for your kids to explore language and speech production with, or social skills, just be mindful of those signs that they could fall into a dopamine feedback loop. And I'm going to provide some examples of how to prevent that digital dependency. So, to prevent kids from falling into like a dopamine feedback loop, focus on activities that have slow paces to them. So, not anything that is very fast paced, where they have to kind of increase their processing to kind of match up with the game, which would be too fast for day to day language processing. Make sure they're taking regular breaks if they're going to do online stuff. Avoid overstimulating material. This can be really easy for kids that are very sensory motivated to kind of get stuck on, and they'll have a hard time communicating because they're more focused on bright flashing lights or fast-paced storytelling. Also avoid activities that have like a gambling element, so like loot boxes or rewarding, or games that reward excessive gameplay. So like there's a lot of games that, the more you play it, you get certain achievements. It can be kind of fulfilling for a child. So just being able to avoid those, because those are going to be the kind of games that impede communication, and then they'll also have mental health effects as well, negative mental health effects. All right, so at the end of the day, my take home message for you guys is it's not as much about what you have, so the specific toy or specific book or whatever, it's what you do with it. When I think about what a professor told me in grad school, it's like you should be able to make a speech therapy session happen with one pen, and that's it. So that's kind of the idea that I want you guys to take away from this. Not to say that you all are SLPs or that, it's going to be as easy for you guys, but I would say just kind of keep that mindset in mind, being able to just kind of explore anything and everything and how we can make language out of it. And, not worry as much about what you have or what kind of toys you buy. You don't have to have $50 toys to, teach speech and language. There's so much you can do with everything. So engagement and interaction is the best tool in your toolbox for sure. All right. So that's the end of my presentation. This is my contact information. You can reach me at my email address, which is there on the screen, Alexa at Brain Positive Therapy. Business phone number is also below, 404-369-0814. And then my business website is also at the bottom. So if you're interested in learning more about me as a professional, you can head over to brainpositivetherapy.com. And that is it.
Alexa, thank you so much for all of that information. If any of our parents have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or add a question into that chat box for Alexa to answer. Alexa, no questions yet, but we do have people saying thank you in the chat box. Very grateful for your time.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed getting to talk about this topic.
Yes, thank you. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions at the moment, but again, Alexa gave us her information. That way, if you want to reach out to her again, you can shoot her an email or give her business office a call. Alexa, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. I hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon/evening, and I'll see you guys next time, okay?
Yes, thank you, Alexa. Everyone have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.